I have been inviting people to come and give a little short presentation here. First time we had a person from Genentech talk about the protein purification, which was very enlightening. Then we had the Zoom bombing that was accidental, but it worked very well with David Drano. And the last time, Chancellor Gary May showed up in class to talk to us. And it was a wonderful experience that I think it might be a lifetime experience. I don't see that happen often, the Chancellor coming to undergraduate class. So the bar was raised so high that everyone might be expecting who's going to be next. Maybe Joe Biden, you know. Better than that, we have a distinguished Professor Bruce Hammock that's walking right now. And so this is distinguished Professor Bruce Hammock, like I mentioned. So for the students on Zoom, let me see if they are seeing this well. So they see Bruce Hammock here. So this is Professor Bruce Hammock. He's a distinguished professor, and he's one of the many specialists in catalysis on this campus. We taught together for 13 years. We taught insect physiology together. It was a lot of fun. Bruce is a wonderful instructor also, and he came here today maybe to explain a little bit about the transition state. What about that, Bruce?
Okay.
Can you?
So Walter tells me you guys have been learning about enzymes, right? Does anybody know what an enzyme is? Okay, what's an enzyme? Okay, and so what does it do? It speeds up a reaction, right? Did you ever think, how does an enzyme actually speed up a reaction? Because I never had. And then a guy named Linus Pauling thought about it, and he actually figured it out years ago. So enzymes are catalysts, and your catalytic converter on a car is a catalyst. And what an enzyme does as a catalyst is it works like every other catalyst. So how does every catalyst work? Does anybody know that? Yeah. By lowering the transition state energy. And that is really profound and clever, and nobody had thought of it till 1947, when Linus Pauling thought of it. So if we're looking at how do enzymes work, or how does any catalyst work, let's say we have a substrate, and we have an energy hump, and we go down here to a product. So this could be starch in a soda cracker in your cabinet. And you have to wait a very, very long time for that starch to become sugar. And yet if you put it in your mouth, you taste salt, but then the salt dissolves and goes away. And then you begin to taste sugar because the enzyme has lowered this hump and you're now converting starch into sugar in a downhill reaction. So it's that energy hump that keeps all these starch molecules vibrating over here in this little pit from making it over the hill and down to sugar. And so that's how every catalyst works. Some catalysts can also bring two divergent molecules together, but ultimately what they're doing is removing that barrier or that hump and let the reaction go downhill. So this is one of the really famous graphs in biochemistry, which violates all the principles that you're supposed to use in papers. It has an arbitrary scale down here called a reaction coordinate. Nobody knows what it is, and it doesn't have any numbers. And then we have this one, which is free energy. And even physicists can't understand that, but the higher the harder, basically with free energy. So how does an enzyme reduce this energy pump? Are there any ideas? And you came up with a good one. Are there others? It changes, it makes a conformational change, and basically you're right on target. What Uncle Linus Pauling figured out in 47, asking how do enzymes speed up reactions, figured, well, they have to reduce the activation energy. On a couple of cases, maybe they can reduce it by bringing two products close proximity. But your average hydrolytic enzyme can only do it one way, and that's by binding to the transition state. And so the way a catalyst speeds things up is it will bind to this transition state and it will reduce this energy. And it often does it by taking this simple reaction and dividing it maybe into a couple of little reactions. And each of these would be a transition state. And what was so brilliant about this was that it was so simple, but nobody had thought of it before Linus Pauling, and it completely changed how we think of enzymology. But he didn't publish it in Journal of Biological Chemistry. He published it in C&E News, which is sort of a throwaway from the field, because he didn't think it was all that important. At any rate, the enzyme then is binding to these transition states, reducing this transition state energy. And then Pauling did something else that was brilliant. And that is just using really simple algebra, even algebra that I can understand. He asked how tightly does this enzyme have to bind to this transition state in order to get the rate acceleration that we see as starch goes to sugar. It turns out that it has to bind with a phenomenal affinity. So maybe it's binding 10 to the 5th to 10 to the 10th, better than the substrate or the product. So if you've got a Km, which is sort of vaguely affinity, that could say you're binding to the transition state at 10 to the minus 10th, 10 to the minus 15th molar. That's tighter than estrogen binds to its receptor. So these are incredibly tight binding interactions, which is really clever. And by binding to these multiple transition states, we reduce the activation energy, the substrate goes to the product, and the cracker in your mouth becomes sweet. Now, what are you guys going to do when you grow up, if you graduate? Any ideas? There's the Marine Corps, right? What else? You have an idea? What do you want to do? Okay. So there are lots of occupations, and some of them could use enzymes. They are used in industrial chemicals. So for a while, we had a company in Davis. If you've ever wondered what a ton of enzyme looked like, you could go into the entrance of their company and see this huge bag where you could actually see a ton of enzyme. But another thing to do is you could go into an evil pharma company and you can try to have a molecule that binds to a receptor or inhibits an enzyme and thus develop it as a drug. So there's some enzymes that we want to turn down a bit or actually turn off completely. And you can find these magic compounds a lot of ways. One is to have a library of hundreds of thousands of compounds, and you run a really fast assay, and you screen through the compounds, and you find a few that actually work. And those are your leads as a synthetic chemist to make other molecules that are better inhibitors. So we've done a bunch of these screens. We've never found anything. It's been nice to not find things because we find that our enzyme isn't inhibited by a whole lot of things. The other way to go after it is to be really an insidious biochemist. So you guys all know that the transition state is binding to the enzyme better than the substrate, better than the product by orders of magnitude. So if you want to kill an enzyme, a great way to do it is to mimic a transition state. Now, is anybody in here a synthetic chemist? You've had organic chemistry. Can you make a transition state? Have a bottle of transition state? No, really pretty hard to make. So it's an impossible goal, except that if that transition state, let's say, is binding to 10 to the minus 18 molar, you don't have to be the exact mimic of the transition state. What you can do is even get close. So if you can get close to those little pink stars, you can kill the enzyme. And so a lot of us spend our time dreaming at night, how do we kill enzymes? And a great way to kill an enzyme is transition state. So Linus Pauling developed a theory that led to the development of lots of different herbicides, insecticides, pharmaceuticals. A lot of the cancer drugs that we have now are all based on the idea that Uncle Linus had and didn't actually think it was worth publishing in a scientific paper. Do any of you guys have questions about enzymes or transition states? Because Walter wants to tell you stuff that has to be on the exam. I just want to have fun. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah, and that's a really good idea. So you can make the reaction speed up by increasing the background radiation or background infrared, and you can make it go down in the same way. You can also do that with any catalyst or with no catalyst at all. But what we're trying to do here is just for fun, to be really insidious and design a chemical tool to block it. But certainly industrial. People are continually working on adjusting the temperature of the bioreactors to get optimum yield and to minimize side reactions. Yeah.
Are there any beings that are fungal or bacterial or viral that have those abilities that we're trying to use that wants to do, like the enzyme? Are there any outer species that can mimic what we're trying to achieve?
Oh, yeah. Yes. So transition state inhibitors are widely used in nature, that a lot of poisons have to be transition state inhibitors. If we look at the nerve gases developed during World War II, they are covalent inhibitors, but they bind to the enzyme first because they're actually mimicking the transition state along the reaction coordinate. So that's the actual binding energy. And then they go ahead and form a bond. So in my lab, we've been trying to make transition state inhibitors, and we have one now in human clinical trials to replace opiate analgesics. And it was designed based on saying, what is the transition state of this reaction? And we know we can't mimic it, but if we even get a little bit close, and so our compounds are working at maybe below 50 picomolar. So they're fantastically potent compounds. Of course, the real transition state is binding even better. Are there other questions before I leave and brave the wet?
Thank you, Bruce. We
me.
used to teach together, like I said, insect physiology. It was a class of 50 students, and the final exam was oral exam. Each student 30 minutes. Took the whole week to interrogate all these students. It was fun, right, Bruce?
Yeah, it was fun for us. But we would have students have a practice so they wouldn't be terrified. Have any of you ever had an oral exam? A few of you have, but when you go out into the real world and you're interviewing for a place in a medical school or a place in Pfizer or a graduate school somewhere, you'll probably have an oral exam. And you've never had one, and they're really important. So Walter and I figured that it would be good that if students at least once in their lives had an oral exam. So what we did was to say people could bring as many note cards as they wanted, and we would give them a demonstration of how the oral exam would work. And a student would come in and we would ask them a very simple question in physiology or biochemistry. And they would have their stack of cards. And the first thing that would happen is they would get nervous and the cards would go everywhere. And we figured it didn't matter because they probably learned an awful lot of physiology and biochemistry making those cards. And then they would start answering a question that Walter had. And then using a trick out of John Cleese, I had a little bell. And they would be starting in their answer, and then I would say, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, bing, just to relax them. And I think it was insidious of us, but it helped people in the practice get used to actually talking in front of other people. So if you get a chance, please do.
So I'm contemplating inviting Bruce for the our final exam to be oral, okay? On 24th. Is that all right? Everyone is agreement with that? I don't
So
think
I'll
so.
see you later, Walter.
Thanks so much, Bruce. That was
Thanks for
great.
having me. I
Appreciate
love
that.
it.
All right, so let me move the microphone.
I'm gonna,